places in our military where we are trained to start and fuel insurgencies.
That's the same kind of they've been doing their whole career. Now they're doing it here inside the United States.
Anybody who says that this can't happen in a worse way, either they're ignorant or they're part of the problem.
Today, domestic terrorism is the greatest terrorist threat facing the United States.
The CIA has this tool where they measure levels of insurgency, and if you just apply the tool to the US, we are in an incipient insurgency.
Do you want your house back? Take it!
How did I end up on one side of that door, and my fellow veterans, how did they end up on the other side of that door?
If you believe the country's under attack, you have a certain set of skills, you're a force multiplier.
They're coming.
It's going to end up the people versus the government.
If you're armed, then you're prepared to defend your family. And if you're not armed, you're dog meat.
When you can convince people that their leaders are not valid, then you give them the excuse to overthrow that leadership.
And that's not new. The issue is that the people that we are identifying as extremists, they're identifying as patriots or freedom fighters. It almost sounds like I'm talking about terrorism right now.
Everyone becomes more violent in the aftermath of warfare. What we don't know is what happens when we're talking about a 20-year war.
I hope that people are f***ing scared, because being scared motivates people.
This is how countries fall apart.
Oh my God!
I could see a civil war.
And this fight, it's far from over, and it may never be over.
I,
Standing with
Lisa
Crystal,
Fon,
do solemnly
I will
swear
support
The
and defend
Constitution of the United
States
States.
against all enemies.
Foreign and domestic.
So help me God.
So help me
So
God.
help me God.
That was the trailer for the documentary feature Against All Enemies. And this is Factual America. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood. Each week I watch a hit documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and their subjects. Why would U.S. military veterans take up arms against the country they swore to protect? That is the question that Against All Enemies tries to answer. While most U.S. veterans are successful in their transition to civilian life, an increasingly radicalized element is drawn to insurrectionist movements, such as the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, among others. Joining us is director and producer Charlie Sadoff. His quest to answer a seemingly simple question with its roots in January 6th led him to explore the historical roots of the insurrectionist cause in America and its conspiracy-fueled draw for today's veterans. In the end, Charlie fears we are in for another wave of political violence as Americans head to the polls in November. Stay tuned. Charlie Sadoff, welcome to Factual America. How are things with you?
Things are good. Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Just to remind our listeners and viewers, we will be talking about your feature doc, Against All Enemies, premiered at Tribeca, is that right, in 2023? And
right.
Yeah, and now it's being released in theaters in North America, and it's also on video on demand at all the usual suspects from March 29th. Is that in 2024? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, well, excellent.
Although I will say we've actually already had a broadcast in Germany and France.
Okay.
Towards the beginning of the year, it's
Right.
they recut the movie a little bit for audiences that might not be as aware of certain
Right.
things that we took for that we sort of take for granted in making the film for a U.S. audience, but it was on Arte and WDR already in Europe.
Oh, wow. Okay. Any so we're a UK-based podcast, as our listeners should know. Any chances it might be seeing it here anytime soon, as far as you're aware?
I hope so.
Yeah.
We're always looking for additional territories to screen it and show it. So my hope is that it will be eventually on in the UK.
Okay. So first question is usually to our filmmakers is, what is Against All Enemies all about? Maybe you can give us a little synopsis for those who haven't had a chance to check it out yet.
Well, the premise of the film is pretty simple. And we sort of start the film with a question, which is, why would U.S. military veterans take up arms against the country they had sworn an oath to protect? And that derives obviously from what happened on January 6th, where there were a number of veterans
Right.
who were part of that insurrection and who made it more potent because of their military training. And so the film seeks to answer that question. And as we go, as filmmaker, as I was trying to answer that question, it led to more questions.
Right.
And different threads that I didn't necessarily anticipate when we originally started. And so the film essentially gets into the history of veterans in the United States becoming part of insurrectionist causes, beginning with the KKK, leading up through to today, where we have groups like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or the Three Percenters, which are violent extremist groups here in the United States. And so we get into why veterans become part of these groups, how they're recruited, and what the impact is of them being in these groups and the danger they present. And I think it's important, at the outset to say that it's a very small percentage of veterans who become part of these groups.
Indeed.
But veterans, because of their military training and the cachet that they hold in the United States, have an outsized impact on them. Militarily, they can be what we call force multipliers. They can make the other members of the group more effective in whatever sort of mission they take on. But also they give these groups credibility because, as I said, veterans in the United States have a lot of credibility themselves. And so they transfer that credibility to these groups in ways that they might not otherwise have.
There's a lot to unpick there, and there's a lot that you include in your film. But maybe we can say, because keep in mind that we do have an international audience, they may not be so familiar. These extremist groups, I mean, you've already mentioned some of them, ones that have sort of internationally people have heard of, like the Proud Boys, but you also include ones that I hadn't even heard of, and I'm an avid follower of U.S. politics. But I mean, who are they? What do they want to do? What are their intentions, really?
So we actually have someone in the film who addresses that question head on.
Yeah.
And he says they're all different in they all have differences, but essentially what unites them all is they all want power. They want to return the United States to people that they believe are rightfully in power, which are essentially white people. And probably you could dig a little deeper and say white Christian men. But that's essentially what unites them. They had power, we had power, we're losing power, we want power, and we will do what is necessary to get our power back. That's what unites these groups, and that's what they want.
But I mean, I guess, and without getting into all the details, because people should watch the film, but there's all these like subsets and subgenre, groups. But I mean, they're not all white supremacists, are they? I mean, there is something additionally that, even if it's about not returning, I mean, and I grant you, and you document it well. There's a large segment of that, but it's almost there's a sort of also an element of wanting a perceived view of America as it used to be, and wanting it to thinks it's lost its way. I guess, is that another way of kind of putting it?
I think that's MAGA, Make America Great Again.
Right.
Returning to, but what you have to ask yourself the question: what is it that we're returning to?
Yeah.
And you're right. Not everyone in these groups is a white supremacist. Right. They're able to recruit all kinds of people into their groups. But I think when people are saying we want to return to the way things were, at their root, what they're saying is we don't want anyone other than white people in charge. And that's fueled a lot in this country by the changing demographics of America. In 2040, America is going to be a minority majority country. So the changing demographics of the United States fuels a lot of this, a lot of the sort of fear of losing control and losing power.
Right. And also, I mean, there's that element. Also, we're in a world of, rapid change, right? So, there's a lot of elements to this, but I would have thought, but immigration, all kinds of things. Things are changing, and I guess I don't know best way of putting it. There's certainly a feeling that like you said, they want to, whatever it is, whatever they perceive was this, or what they want to return to. These are people who are willing to take arms to achieve that. Is that right?
Some of them, yes. And you mentioned immigration. So there's sort of a theory espoused in the United States called the Great Replacement Theory, which sort of holds that the people in charge, Democrats, but originally it was Jews, are conspiring to let immigrants into the country so that they can overwhelm the electorate with their votes and therefore push white people out of control, no longer have the power to win elections because we're going to be replacing everyone with immigrants. Right. So that's the real fear of him. That's what white supremacists and these groups are talking about when they're talking about immigration.
Yeah. And so, then the other element of this is the question you originally started with is why U.S. servicemen veterans, a small group, but would leave the armed forces and then join groups that would, by their very nature, make them renege the oath they took when they joined the army or any of the armed forces. And so, you do explore what is it particularly that you think? Is it related to the training they receive in the military? Is it because they take this oath to protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic? I guess each individual is going to have their own sort of reasons, but is it because it's difficult to transition to civilian life for some? We've even had a doc about that on here. I know it's very difficult for certainly combat veterans to transition back.
I think you've nailed it. I mean, you touched on a lot of the reasons. I mean, we'll start with the transition out of the military into civilian life, which most veterans make that transition pretty well, but a number don't. And they're looking for the sense of purpose, the sense of camaraderie, the sense of mission that they had in the military that they might not be finding anymore. And these groups can sometimes offer that. There's a group called the Oath Keepers, which was led by someone named Stuart Rhodes, who's now in jail. He's got an 18-year sentence as a result of his involvement in January 6th.
Right.
But Stuart Rhodes is a very charismatic figure, Yale educated.
Right.
And when he, in the film, you see when he comes along and he recruits, and he's trying to recruit people into the Oath Keepers, he has a good story to tell. He can talk about how, the government is trying to take away your guns. The government has torn up the Constitution right in front of you. Our cities are being attacked by Black Lives Matter. This is your chance to support the Constitution, protect your rights. And as other people in the film say, it's a chance to fight again, which for a number of veterans is something that's alluring.
Right.
So there's that. But as you said, there's lots of things that can bring people into this movement. We can talk a little bit about this in greater detail later on, but there's sort of what's described as a salad bar of grievance narratives that you can sort of exploit to get people into your cause. And this goes back to the days of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, which was formed after the Civil War here by a veteran of the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And the KKK was very adept at changing its recruiting pitch depending on sort of what the issues were at any given place at any given time. And so now in the United States, there's lots of things that you can use to bring people in. You can be, as you said before, anti-immigrant. You can be anti-Black, anti-Jewish, any grievance narrative you can come up with. The LGBTQ are grooming our children. And of course, the big lie here in the United States is a big recruiting tool now, because the idea that you served in the military to defend the country, and now you've been convinced that there's a crime family, that's the Biden crime family, is now in power when he actually stole the election. The election was stolen. So if you can convince someone that that's true, veteran or otherwise, that's a strong argument to make.
Yeah, and I think what your film does well too is what struck me was there's some different scenes with not just any one individual, but also talking about these sort of dog whistles, right? That maybe they're kind of things that pass, like for the average person who comes across some of this stuff, it doesn't really mean anything, but there is this sort of messaging that comes through that, it can go from certainly, Trump's comments at the debate when he was talks about the Proud Boys, but there's even little things that are even harking back to, as you say, to even the very early days of certainly the Ku Klux Klan, but this idea of a Jewish cabal that's in charge of everything. It's just these kind of little signals that these groups have are very good at wielding while still kind of flying under the radar.
One of my goals with the film after I got into it and sort of realized for myself what was happening is that I wanted people to understand that, as you said, these more subtle dog whistles are actually the same thing that people like Louis Beam, who's a military veteran who profiled in the film, who became the head of the Texas KKK and used his military service as a means of recruiting people into the KKK for his cause, which was basically to overthrow the government. He was overt. He was not scared to say things that I can't even repeat here about Black people or Jews. Yeah. But there's a through line from him to some of the folks today, and the message is the same. It's just, as you said, a little bit more subtle and not as overt. But it's all part of, as I was saying before, this idea that we need to return to make sure that white people stay in power. And that means and he uses the phrase by any means necessary. And so that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. It can manifest itself as violence. It can manifest itself in trying to keep people from voting, whatever it takes. So that's what I hope people understand when they see the film, is that what you're referring to as these subtle dog whistles, what they're really about.
And you've in the process, you've gained some close access to some of these groups. I mean, you already mentioned the Oath Keepers. I think we've got some never before seen footage of them, and I mean big events of the last few years where they were involved. You certainly have cameras there. How did you manage that, and why are they so keen to allow you filmmakers like yourself to tag along for these things? Are they how did you manage to gain that sort of access?
So that Oath Keeper footage that you're referring to, that's from a scene. A lot of what we're seeing there is from a scene in Louisville, where they've gone to supposedly protect local businesses from rioters and looters in the aftermath of the case of Breonna Taylor.
Right.
And that footage was actually shot by two filmmakers who I came to know, and we actually acquired their footage from them.
Right.
But the Stuart Rhodes and the Oath Keepers, or General E, who we interviewed, from Three Percenters of the Southern Patriot Council, which he's called, or Randy Ireland from the Proud Boys, who I interviewed.
Yeah.
To answer your question, they're perfectly happy to talk if you can convince them that they're going to get a fair shake.
Right.
I don't think, and that's what I think we were able to do, is we were able to sort of tell them, yeah, we're going to let you speak your mind, and we're not going to edit it to make you look any worse than you actually are. Right. So they are perfectly happy to talk, and they believe in what they're saying. They're not ashamed of what they have to say. They think that they're patriots. They think that they're supporting the Constitution. And so they are happy to get their story out, and they want to advocate for their positions. So the access is, you have to get to them, and you have to find ways to get to them. And I had a great team who helped me get inroads and introductions.
I mean, did anything surprise you? Let's say your conversations with General E, which I found very interesting, because I was born and raised in Texas. So
I know you're from Texas. I was going to say, what do you think of General E?
What do I think of him? Well, I think he's well, I had a conversation earlier today because with someone who's got some Texas ties, and he said, what am I doing tonight? And I mentioned this, and I said, well, what maybe not surprise you? There's someone with a militia connection. He goes, oh yeah, well, I could hear him over the phone roll his eyes. So I know there's that element there, as you mentioned also, what's his name? Beam, who is there's always been this, the Texas KKK. And as you say, it was much more overt back when I was a kid, and it was more, even, I mean, I'm not making light of this whole thing, but I even think back to the Blues Brothers, right? Where they have the scene where they hate I hate Illinois Nazis. I mean, they were like literally, it was very kind of in your face, very anti-American in a different way, like actually wearing swastikas and stuff like that, right? So what did I think? I thought,
well, as a fellow Texan,
yeah. What do I think? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't, because he what was interesting was he was raising this point about a lot of this is because he's Texan and it's his values, right? And this values of self, being able to, not even so much the bootstrap stuff, but just that you have to, you have to defend yourself. You have to be able to, that's a Texan, is someone who knows how to defend themselves. I mean, I have to say, he does remind me of who's no longer in the family, but an ex-uncle of mine, to be honest with you, who had very similar sort of demeanor and aspects to him. Like you said, like with the veterans, like anything, these aren't like a large percentage of the population, or any of these things. So I just know these people do exist, and they're very, I guess so what do I think as a Texan? I'm not like, I feel like it's kind of it's not even so much something very Texan specifically. I think it's very just sort of, there is always and has been and continues to be this strain of America that exists, that is susceptible to these insurrectionist groups, whether it's the original KKK, and they've had their different waves, obviously, and they've this. And I know we could have a long we could have series about, does this go back to the founding of the U.S. and, and all this kind of stuff that perpetuates this feeling that, people want to, who maybe are misguided or a sort of self-reliance, independence run amok, basically. I mean, General E
I found him to be fascinating.
He's,
first of all, for a film, you always sort of
exactly
like people who are great storytellers, and
right.
Great storyteller.
Well, he's a Texan. That is a Texan thing. We are a state of storytellers. So I'll give you that.
But you'll notice we filmed him on his ranch, and he has the state of Texas flag out on him, hung up. Right. I mean, and not the United States flag. So this idea of Texas and the Texan being self-reliant, as you said, is obviously very important to him.
Right.
I think what was particularly interesting about him is that he, on the one hand, he seems like this, I enjoyed speaking with him. I I didn't feel threatened by him.
Right.
Overtly. But then you see all the other things he gets up to.
Yeah.
And not when he wasn't interviewing me. And, he's creating a hit list of people who have betrayed the country that,
right.
He said, if something happens to these people, I wouldn't shed a tear.
Yeah.
So there's two sides to him,
but
also he's clearly he believes all of what he's saying, but I think he's been led down a path of misinformation that's quite unfortunate, because he's getting his information and his news from not necessarily the most reliable sources. And he's very much influenced by General Michael Flynn, who,
right,
you know, if your audience is familiar with him, he was a former general in the United States, the head of the director of national intelligence under the Obama administration. Then he was a national security advisor for Trump, but he was actually then fired and then convicted of crimes dealing with dealing with Russia and Turkey. He was convicted, and then Trump pardoned him. And anyway, ever since he left the Trump administration, he's sort of been out on a rampage against everyone who sort of wronged him.
Right.
So he was a big act. He was a very big actor in January 6th and leading up to January 6th. And since then, he's gone around the country, grooming and recruiting for what he calls his army of digital soldiers. And we have people in the film espousing the idea that he is fomenting another insurrection against the United States. And that's his goal.
Well, then, since you brought up again, and rightfully so, let's take this back to January 6th. Were you there? Because I know you've got footage that's from
I was not there, but two of my associate producers were there and were inside the Capitol. Right. And a lot of the footage in our film is from them.
Okay. Because what I think was, obviously this has been, in docs and just generally in the news, obviously quite a bit. But what your film, what I thought was unique, one of the things I thought was unique was that it shows very well the military precision and tactics of this. I think we all knew about these different extremist groups were involved. We also know there were people who were not extremist groups that were there, that were part of the crowd. But just the sort of, I think you even have it's a great way you filmed it in terms of just zeroing in, just showing that how it's obviously these groups were planning ahead. I know someone who was there. They were filming it on a different dock, and they had been going to stop the steel rallies in the weeks leading up to this, and they said they didn't know exactly what was going to go down, but they knew something was going to go down.
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem so. There's, people, however the mass media is dealing with it. It's obvious that there were a lot of planning went into this.
Yeah. Some of it was spontaneous, but for some of the groups, it was organized. And, that's why Stuart Rhodes was convicted, because he and the Oath Keepers planned planned well out what they were going to do. And as you said, we do have footage of the Oath Keepers marching in formation, creating a breach, and then sort of helping everyone else get inside. And there was definitely military tactics going on there, not just from them, but from other groups as well. And so that's more or less towards the beginning of the film that this was happening. So why is this happening? And Jason Crow, who's a congressman in the United States,
right?
He was barricaded inside the floor of the chamber of the House, and he's a former Army special ranger. So he was someone who served overseas, who is not prone to hyperbole, and knows real violence when he sees it. And he had fought in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And when they were barricaded in, he thought he was going to have to maybe fight his way out. He calls his wife and, basically says, this might be it. Mm. And we have this scene where he's there and they've barricaded the door. And he asks, in the film, he asks this question: how did I, a veteran, end up on one side of this door?
Right.
And other veterans who swore the same oath I did end up on the other side of this door. And so that to me was a very sort of provocative question, and the fact that it was coming from him made it all the more powerful.
Okay. I think we'll stop there for a moment. We're going to give our listeners and viewers a quick break, and we'll be right back with Charlie Sadoff, the producer and director of Against All Enemies, a theatrical release in North America on March 29th. You can also stream it on all the usual places, also from March 29th. You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or X. to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America. Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with Charlie Sadoff, the producer and director of Against All Enemies, releasing in the U.S. and theaters on March 29th, and you can also stream it from that same day. So we've talked about January 26th, but another thing that January 6th, another thing you raise, kind of look at, and let me ask you, do you think January 6th could happen again? And do you think people are being a little bit too blasé about this?
I definitely think their political violence is in the offing. So will it be the same as January 6th?
Yeah.
Probably not, because I would hope that we're more prepared this time to prevent something like that from happening. But I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
There's in Arizona, where the election was heavily disputed in 2020, in which, I don't know if you recall in our film, there's at the Eric Greitens, a former Navy SEAL,
right,
who's running for, at the time that we were filming, was running for Senate in Missouri, the state of Missouri.
Right.
He made a huge part of his campaign this idea that the results of the election results in Arizona need to be looked at, and this is well after after January 6th. This is
right,
well down the line. So I've sort of had my eye on Arizona, and there's a place called Maricopa County where most of the people in Arizona live,
right,
where the results were highly contested. And just last week, the county board of election officials were meeting. And this is something that in normal times, no one would care about. These are
it's like watching paint dry for most people. Yeah.
Who what they do is important, but
exactly,
this is like big government stuff.
Right.
They for 100 years they probably met and no one knew what they were meeting about, and they just went about doing their business. And at the last meeting of this board in Maricopa County, they had to have armed police, SWAT teams, special rules put in place, because they're so afraid that these elected officials, many of whom are Republican, by the way, it's not just Democrats, our lives are in danger because of what they're doing now in terms of getting ready for the election and getting ready for what's going to happen in 2024 in November. So the fact that this local board of elections needs full-time security doesn't speak well for what's going to happen later on down the line. And this is going to be happening all over the country. And so I think that the possibility of violence breaking out in small pockets or in various places is very legitimate. I don't know that we're going to see something like a march on the Capitol again.
Right.
But I think there will be smaller events. And fortunately, on January 6th, there were no guns involved. But as your audience probably knows, there's 400 million guns in the United States and 300 million people.
Right.
And so the real fear is that some of these turn really violent, and it's not just breaking down doors of the Capitol and using the U.S. flag to beat up police officers.
And so then what about, because some of this talk's died down a bit. It was really big in certain circles not long ago, but even this talk about a civil war in the U.S., but a renewed civil war. Do you think that is that something that you're still worried about? Because your film does talk about it.
Yeah, I think so. The Civil War, if there is one, it's not going to be like we had in the 1800s,
right?
Two standing armies going against each other, and it's not going to be thousands of militia trying to take on the U.S. government, the U.S. military or National Guard, or that's not how they're going to operate. It's going to be more of an insurgency. Think about, other places around the world where less powerful forces have used terrorism or select strikes to try and, make their point, intimidate people, terrorize people and then basically to create chaos. And so I think that's more likely what we're going to be seeing if we see violence.
Okay. So I want to try to end this on a more hopeful note, but I think we will get there actually. But before we get to that point, how did you become involved with this project? Was this your idea? What's in terms of making this film?
My co-producer, Ken Harbaugh, is a Navy veteran.
Yeah.
And he and I have known each other for a number of years. And after January 6th, when he saw what we all saw, but he saw it through a slightly different lens, the first thing he noticed was what you talked about and what we talked about previously, is like military veterans being a part of this.
Right.
And so when he was the impetus for the film, because he wanted to get to the bottom of why this was happening and what it meant. And so Ken came to me with the project, and then we went from there.
Okay. And you've got quite a team. It's not just him. You've got others on the team that are all you've got veterans. You've got Sebastian Junger did Restrepo. You've got a lot of people involved with this. And this, I think, Veterans for Responsible Leadership, are they, involved? Is that, so I guess getting to this point of the questions you've raised and your film tries to answer, what has been the reaction to the film so far for those who've had a chance to see it? Capitol Hill and Washington, wider America.
Yeah, I think the film's it's been very well received. It's not a film that people, you say, like the film.
Right, exactly.
But I will say this: there's some funny moments in it. General E has his moments. There's little moments like that. So the film has gotten a very positive reception. We were at Tribeca, like you said. Did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to. I did like the bit where he's standing there in front of the state capitol in Austin. And he tells his guy next to him to knock it off with the F-bombs. That was like,
It always gets you laughing.
And I've got I'm from I have a bit of a soft heart for General E. So yeah, I do recognize how he is filmmaker gold in a lot of way. But yes, but I'll let you continue.
The film, so it's been very well received at various festivals. We were actually at a film festival in Poland where it won the Audience Award for Best Doc. And the reason I mentioned that is because the film happened to be screening right at the time where they had just had their elections.
That's right.
And it was a really, a remarkable event there where the Democratic Party was not thought it possible that they were going to be able to pull that off, and they won. And when I was there, they hadn't had the official transfer of power yet, and there was still this talk of the same thing we hear in the election was stolen, it was rigged, and there's sort of thought I think people sort of were hopefully convinced that power would transition peacefully. Eventually it did.
Yeah.
But so the film really resonated over there. And like I told you earlier, it's actually very popular in Europe because I don't know if it's because Europeans like to look at the United States and see how messed up we are. And
there's an element of that. But
but also I think this idea that where we're headed is something that Europeans in some ways have a little bit more experience with, and maybe are more attuned to it than in some ways the United States is.
Well, I think that does get, there are I think something that your film also talks about is how there aren't you've got these laws or or not, if not even laws, policies, or whatever, that are about foreign terrorism, but not about domestic terrorism. Whereas you definitely in Europe have, certainly Germany's got them, and others who have laws against domestic, because they have their, I mean, go back to the 70s, right? 70s and all the Red Brigade and all those domestic terrorism organizations they had. So they had to fight terrorism back in the day, and so they did put things in place to more effectively deal with it.
Yeah, I think, we talk a little bit about this in the film. You mentioned Red Brigade. The United States has dealt with, fascism and communism before. And as is pointed out in the film by a guy named Michael Breen, we did a pretty good job of combating that in the United States because it was sort of a universal effort, from the government, at least. The government was able to unify around messages, pushing back against the propaganda of Nazism, pushing back against the propaganda of communism. And we can't do that now because the government, it's not unified in that message. There's one party, the Democratic Party, that is pushing back against it, and the Republican Party, for a large part, is embracing it. So it's very difficult to push back against the misinformation.
Yeah. And so back to our question about why veterans, the one you pose about why veterans join these groups, and a small number, but they do. And they, as you said, and the other thing that kept coming to mind in a lot of this footage is just how, I hadn't maybe quite, I think I've always personally, I'm just speaking personally, but kind of some of these groups I always just felt like they're a ragtag group. And I guess in some ways groups they are, but they do have, it was much more militaristic than I realized, I think, in some of the footage you have of, certainly of Oath Keepers and others, and as you document with January 6th. But what do you think some of the solutions are for veterans so that, do they need more support? Do they need change? Do we need to change how military personnel are trained when they're in the Army? What do you think the some of the solutions are?
Okay, I'll get to that in a second, but I want to address your first point first, which is that these are ragtag groups, which I thought some of that too, and I think a lot of people in the United States think that, and so I posed that question to a gentleman named Ali Soufan, who used to work for the FBI and was involved in investigating 9/11 and in counterterrorism. And I said, a lot of people think these groups are like basically the same. I might have even used your words as ragtag. Right. He said, a lot of people think these groups are knuckleheads, but we thought the same thing about the Taliban.
Right.
They're holed up in caves in Afghanistan. They can't do anything. They're not a real threat. And then 9/11 happened and everyone changed their mind. Obviously realized that wasn't the case. And that's how Ali Soufan views these groups, that they are a real threat, and that if we don't take them seriously, we're risking quite a bit, in much the same way that we didn't pay attention enough before 9/11.
Right.
To answer your second question, what do we do? How do veterans get out of this? It's kind of tricky because one of the veterans whose story we followed throughout, Chris Goldsmith, you remember, he was someone who was part of these groups, or who was sort of sucked into this world after he came back from his service in Iraq, and was consumed by conspiracy theories. And what got him out was he actually went to a junior college, a community college, met other people who had a different view than he did, when he could actually talk to them, and he sort of came around and he came out of this bubble. And the problem now is that you don't have to come out of your bubble.
We're so atomized.
Yeah, and so General E, he lives on his ranch, right?
Right.
He's getting all of his news from YouTube.
Right.
Or whatever Michael Flynn has to be saying.
Right.
I don't know that he's exposed to people who have a different worldview, who can sort of maybe engage with him to help shake him out of this. So in that respect, I'm not very hopeful. But if there are, one of the reasons we made the film is so that if people see the film who know veterans who are like this or susceptible to this, that they talk to them. And there's also lots of groups that veterans can be part of that aren't oriented around overthrowing the government.
Right.
There's groups like Team Rubicon here in the United States that trains veterans to be first responders to natural disasters, and they've trained 100,000 veterans so far.
Oh wow!
Lots of other groups like that that give veterans that same sort of sense of camaraderie and purpose, but around really positive things. And so the hope is that more veterans go that way than the other way. You mentioned the transition out of the military. I mean, that's a huge thing. It's called TAP, the Transition Assistance Program. I think, if the military, the U.S. military could, work on that to help veterans transition better and easier and give them a little bit more information, that would certainly be helpful. But that cuts across more than just what we're talking about. That cuts around healthcare and jobs and all kinds of things. It's a real issue that needs to be addressed, but it hasn't. So that's where we are.
Yeah, back to the guy, I forget his name, but the guy you mentioned, is it in Nassau County? But the guy who's
Chris Goldsmith.
Chris Goldsmith, yeah. So he makes that comment. I was like, I think I picked up on what I picked up on, and I forget the exact quote, but I think you're alluding, not more than alluding to it here as well. But he said, well, at least then I had someone, there were people I could talk to, or people reached out to me. I was wearing my hoodie and acting a certain way, and people then started talking with me. And it's not just veterans. That's what ails society, isn't it? We're not. Not to say it's just as easy as it's because of smartphones and everything and social media, but we are not engaging with each other. We're not talking to each other. I think we're all kind of becoming so in our little bubbles and echo chambers that it's making this very, very difficult, isn't it?
It is. You use the word atomize, which I think is a good one. And it makes solving this problem, but lots of other problems are much more difficult, for sure. There's no denying that.
Well, I think we're coming actually to the end of our time together, Charlie, but just a few more questions, if I may. Am I right? Is this your first director credit?
This is the first feature-length film that I've directed. I've directed a number of short films. I've produced, written, and edited a number of documentaries in the past, but this is my directorial debut. Yeah.
Directorial debut. So why'd you choose this one? What was special about this one that you said, no, this is the one where I want to direct this?
Well, like I said, Ken came to me, and I had spent a number of years working on various military veteran programs for different for TV networks around what we call here pro-social movements. And I was helping, I was working on campaigns aimed at helping veterans around healthcare and helping veterans around getting jobs. So I felt like I knew the subject pretty well. I come from a military family, so I felt like I had a good grasp of sort of where to begin and how to talk to veterans. I had a lot of experience with that over the years. So I think that's what sort of led me to say, yeah, I think this is one that I can direct.
Yeah. Well, and then I assume you'll direct some more. What's next for you? Or can you say anything about any projects that are in the works?
Sure. Right now I am co-directing a feature doc, totally different subject matter, about kids in Washington, D.C. who are debaters. And now that you mentioned it, now that I talk about it, and based on what you just said before about us not talking to each other, it's sort of like it's the antidote to this problem, in that these kids have to learn how to debate both sides of a subject and listen to other people's arguments, take the other side if necessary, but it's all about talking and interacting with their teammates and then also with people they're debating against. And so in that way it is related, but it's an interesting subject.
Okay. And when is that? Do you know when that's going to be coming out?
Well, we're still shooting, so it's going to be a while.
So it's got a little ways to go. But all right, well, we look forward to seeing it, and just want to thank you again for for joining us here on Factual America. Just to remind our listeners, we've been talking with Charlie Sadoff, the producer and director of Against All Enemies, theatrical release in North America on March 29th, and you can also start streaming it on that day too. So Charlie, thanks again. We'd love to have you on again sometime, and thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks again for joining us on Factual America. A big shout out to everyone at Intersound Audio in York, England for their great studio and fine editing and production skills. A big thanks to Amy Ord, our podcast manager, who ensures we continue getting great guests onto the show and that everything otherwise runs smoothly. Finally, a big thanks to you, our listeners. Please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas, whether it is on YouTube, social media, or directly by email. And please also remember to like us and share us with your friends and family, wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, which specializes in documentaries, television, and shorts about the U.S. for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is factualamerica.com.